Welcome to the Deep Dive, your express route to really understanding complex topics without getting bogged down.
Exactly.
You're looking to build your knowledge, efficiently, connect the dots without feeling overwhelmed, and that's precisely what we're setting out to do right here.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've given us some really interesting material. Today we're diving into a specific Supreme Court case. It's one that marked a pretty significant point in how we understand the reach of federal power.
Which case is that?
United States v. Lopez, decided back in 1995.
Lopez. Okay.
Yeah.
I've definitely heard that name come up. But what was the core issue there, and why are we still talking about it?
Good questions. We're going to dig right into that. And to really get a handle on its significance, we can't just look at Lopez in isolation.
Right. You need context.
Exactly. We need to see how it fits with other key cases that dealt with the same fundamental question.
Which is?
The scope of Congress's power under something called the Commerce Clause.
Okay. So, our mission today is to unpack Lopez. Understand why it was such a pivotal moment.
Precisely. We want to see where it set the limits for Congress's authority, especially under this Commerce Clause.
And how are we doing that? By comparing it.
Yes. We'll revisit some foundational cases, like Gibbons v. Ogden, then see how that power seemed to, expand quite a bit in cases like Wickard v. Filburn and Heart of Atlanta Motel.
Okay, Wickard, the farmer case, and Heart of Atlanta, that's civil rights.
The very same. And then we'll see how Lopez fits into that picture, and maybe even how it contrasts with the later case, Gonzalez v. Raich.
Got it. So the thread connecting all of these is the Commerce Clause. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Let's start there. What's the backstory? What was it even for?
Right. So if you think back before the Constitution, you had the Articles of Confederation.
Not exactly working smoothly, as I recall.
Not at all. The states had a lot of power to regulate trade individually, and they did. They slapped tariffs on each other's goods, created all sorts of barriers. It was a mess.
Protectionism between states.
Exactly. The framers saw this as a huge weakness. It was stopping a unified national economy from developing.
Makes sense.
So the Commerce Clause was designed to fix that, to give Congress the power to regulate commerce among the several states, basically. Economic activity involving more than one state, to stop those trade wars.
And Gibbons v. Ogden is an early example of this in action.
A really early, really important one, yes.
Steamboats, right. Something about steamboats in New York.
That's the one. So back in the early 1800s, New York State gave Robert Livingston and Robert Fulton a monopoly.
A monopoly on what?
On operating steamboats on all the waterways within New York State. Aaron Ogden got a license from them to run his steamboats between New York City and New Jersey.
Okay.
Then along comes Thomas Gibbons. He has a federal license, granted under an act of Congress, to operate steamboats in those same waters, also carrying passengers between states.
So direct competition. And Ogden sued.
He did. He sued to stop Gibbons, basically arguing New York had the right to control its own waters, monopoly and all.
And the Supreme Court had to decide, federal license versus state monopoly.
And they sided, unanimously, with Gibbons. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote the opinion.
What did Marshall say?
He made it crystal clear. Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. It's comprehensive. It includes navigation.
So boats on rivers between states counts as commerce?
Absolutely. Marshall said interstate commerce isn't just buying and selling goods. It's also transportation. People, goods, moving across state lines, using roads, using waterways.
And since Gibbons was operating between New York and New Jersey?
That was clearly interstate commerce.
Mm.
And because of the Supremacy Clause, the rule that federal law wins if it conflicts with state law, Gibbons' federal license was valid.
And the New York monopoly law?
Unconstitutional.
Yeah.
At least where it conflicted with the federal power over interstate commerce.
Okay, so Gibbons establishes a really broad federal power over economic activity crossing state lines. Sets the foundation.
Totally foundational. A broad interpretation from the get-go. Okay, now let's jump way forward. Great Depression era. Wickard v. Filburn.
Right. This is the one you said often surprises people. Why is that?
Because it seems to stretch that idea of interstate commerce pretty far.
Farmer Filburn and his wheat. What happened?
So, during the Depression, Congress was trying to stabilize farm prices. One way was setting limits on how much wheat farmers could grow.
Okay, quotas.
Right. Roscoe Filburn, a farmer in Ohio, grew more wheat than his quota allowed. But, and this is the key part, he argued the extra wheat wasn't for sale.
What was it for then?
He said it was just for his own use. On his farm. feed for his animals, maybe some for his family. It would never even enter the market, let alone cross state lines.
And they still penalized him.
They did, and he challenged it, taking it all the way up.
So how did the Supreme Court justify regulating wheat grown and used on a single farm under the Interstate Commerce Clause? That seems like a stretch.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But they upheld the penalty. Their logic went like this. Filburn's extra wheat, by itself, may be trivial, insignificant impact on the national market.
Right. One guy's farm feed.
But what if lots of farmers did the same thing? What if everyone grew their own extra wheat instead of buying it on the open market?
Ah, the cumulative effect.
Exactly. The court said if you aggregate the effect, add up all those farmers growing extra wheat for themselves, it would significantly affect the national wheat market. It would reduce demand, mess with prices, and that affects interstate commerce.
So that's the aggregation principle I've heard about?
That's it. Even if an activity is local, maybe even non-commercial on its own, Congress can regulate it if the total effect, summed up across everyone doing it, has a substantial impact on interstate commerce.
Wow. Okay, that's a huge expansion from just regulating steamboats crossing state lines.
It really is.
Yeah.
Suddenly, your personal choices on your own property could potentially fall under federal regulation if they impacted a national market in the aggregate. Big implications for federal power.
Definitely. Okay, so from Wickard's broad reach, let's shift to the Civil Rights era. Heart of Atlanta Motel v. United States. Using the Commerce Clause for something different here, right? Social issues.
Yes, a very different context, but relying on that same clause. So you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, landmark legislation.
Prohibiting discrimination.
Right, based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, in places of public accommodation. Hotels, restaurants, theaters, that kind of thing.
And the Heart of Atlanta Motel.
They refused to rent rooms to black customers. They challenged the Civil Rights Act, arguing Congress didn't have the power under the Commerce Clause to force them to serve certain people.
Yeah.
They saw themselves as just a local business.
How did the court respond to that? Did they buy the local business argument?
No, they didn't. The Supreme Court ruled against the motel.
What was their reasoning? How did motel discrimination connect to interstate commerce?
Their reasoning was that racial discrimination in places like hotels significantly affects interstate travel.
How so?
Well, if black travelers couldn't find lodging or feared facing discrimination when they traveled.
They'd be less likely to travel between states.
Exactly. It would deter interstate travel, disrupting the flow of people and money across state lines. So the court said Congress could prohibit this discrimination because, again, think aggregation.
Right, the cumulative effect.
Discrimination across the country in the aggregate definitely impacted interstate commerce. Here, commerce was explicitly interpreted to include the movement of people across state lines.
And discrimination was seen as a barrier to that movement, a barrier to commerce.
Precisely. It wasn't just about the motel's individual room rentals. It was about the overall impact on the national economy tied to travel. It shows how the Commerce Clause became a tool to address major social problems that had, well, economic ripples.
Okay, so we have Gibbons setting a broad foundation, Wickard expanding it with aggregation, Heart of Atlanta applying it to civil rights via travel. It seems like Congress's power under the Commerce Clause just kept growing.
That was definitely the trend for decades.
Yep.
And then we get to 1995 and United States v. Lopez.
The case we started with, the one that supposedly put on the brakes.
That's the one. This is where the court, after a long time, seemed to say, whoa, hold on, there are limits.
Okay, tell us about it. What was the law and what did Mr. Lopez do?
So in 1990, Congress passed the Gun-Free School Zones Act, made it a federal crime to knowingly possess a firearm within, I think it was 1,000 feet of a school.
A federal law about guns near local schools.
Right. Alfonso Lopez Jr., a 12th grader in Texas, was arrested for bringing a concealed handgun to his high school. He was convicted under this federal law.
And he challenged it. On what grounds?
He argued Congress had overstepped, that regulating guns in a local school zone wasn't something the Constitution gave the federal government power to do, specifically under the Commerce Clause.
And the Supreme Court, did they agree with Lopez?
They did. In a pretty landmark 5-4 decision, they struck down the Gun-Free School Zones Act.
Wow. Okay, why? What was the reasoning for saying this wasn't covered by the Commerce Clause, especially after cases like Wickard?
Chief Justice Rehnquist wrote the majority opinion. He laid out 3 broad categories of activity Congress can regulate under the Commerce Clause.
What are they?
Okay, first, the channels of interstate commerce. Think highways, waterways, airways. The paths commerce travels on.
Makes sense, like in Gibbons.
Second, the instrumentalities of interstate commerce, or persons or things in interstate commerce. So trains, planes, trucks, the goods being shipped, even the people traveling.
Also logical, like Heart of Atlanta.
And third, activities that have a substantial relation to interstate commerce. This is the tricky one. This is where Wickard falls.
Right, the aggregation principle. So where did possessing a gun in a school zone fit, or rather not fit?
That was the key question. The court looked at possessing a gun near a school and said, that in itself is not an economic activity.
Not economic. But didn't the government argue there were economic consequences? Like gun violence affects education, which affects the economy?
Oh, they absolutely argue that. They drew a chain of connection. Guns, school violence, worse education, less productive workforce, damaged national economy.
And the court didn't buy it.
They found that chain too attenuated, too indirect, too many steps. They worried if that kind of reasoning was enough, what couldn't Congress regulate?
Good point. Where would the limit be?
Exactly. Rehnquist famously wrote something like, if we accept the government's logic here, it's hard to see any individual activity Congress couldn't regulate. They drew a line.
And the line was economic activity.
Pretty much. The activity itself needed to be economic in nature, or at least directly regulating something economic, possessing a gun near a school. They said that's fundamentally criminal, not commercial. Unlike growing wheat, even for yourself, which is agricultural, hence economic.
That's a critical distinction, then, between Lopez and Wickard, the nature of the activity being regulated.
Absolutely crucial. It wasn't enough that the activity might eventually ripple out and have some distant economic effect. The court required a closer link, especially if the activity wasn't inherently economic.
So Lopez was the first time since, what, the 1930s?
Since the New Deal era, yeah. The first time the court actually struck down a federal law for exceeding the Commerce Clause power. It signaled a potential shift, maybe strengthening states' roles, sometimes called the devolution revolution.
So if we look back again at Gibbons, Wickard, Heart of Atlanta, what are the real factual differences that made those cases come out upholding federal power while Lopez went the other way?
Well, in Gibbons, it was obvious, right? Steamboats crossing state lines, that is interstate commerce.
Cut.
In Wickard, even though Filburn's own actions were local and maybe non-commercial, the underlying regulated thing, weed production is definitely economic. And the court focused on the aggregate market effect.
Economic activity, aggregate effect.
Got it. And Heart of Atlanta, running a motel, serving travelers who cross state lines.
Yeah.
Again, fundamentally commercial. And the discrimination directly impacted that interstate travel, that flow of commerce.
Okay, so in all those, there's a much more direct link to economic activity or the actual channels and instrumentalities of commerce.
Exactly. The Lopez court just didn't see that direct link with carrying a gun near a school. The connection to the economy was, in their view, just too indirect, too speculative. It really underscores how the specific facts matter immensely in these cases.
Okay, that clarifies Lopez a lot. But then, how does Gonzalez v. Raich fit in?
Yep.
That was decided after Lopez, right? The medical marijuana case.
Yes, 2005. And it's a really interesting comparison because, on the surface, it might look a bit like Lopez regulating something happening within one state based on a state law.
Right. California allowed medical marijuana, but federal law banned it. So federal versus state again. Did Lopez's reasoning apply?
Well, the court ultimately sided with the federal government in Raich. They upheld the Federal Controlled Substances Act's application even to marijuana, grown and used entirely within California for medical purposes, consistent with state law.
Wait, how did they square that with Lopez? Wasn't this local activity too?
They distinguished it. The majority in Raich said, look, unlike possessing a gun near a school, Lopez, growing and distributing marijuana, even for medical use, that is economic activity.
Ah, the economic activity distinction again.
Exactly. They leaned heavily on Wickard v. Filburn. They argued that even homegrown medical marijuana in the aggregate could find its way into the illegal interstate market, affecting supply and demand nationally.
So back to the aggregation principle, but applied because the underlying activity was deemed economic.
Precisely. They saw it as regulating a class of activities, the production and distribution of a commodity that has a substantial effect on interstate commerce when viewed nationally. The federal law was part of a bigger scheme to control the drug market. They explicitly said Lopez involved a non-economic activity, making it different.
So Raich didn't overturn Lopez, it just clarified that Wickard's aggregation logic still holds strong for things considered economic.
That's a great way to put it. Lopez set a limit for non-economic local activity, with only attenuated links to commerce. Raich confirmed that when the activity is economic, even if local, Wickard's logic about aggregate effects still gives Congress broad power.
Interesting. Were there differing opinions in Raich? Any mention of federalism?
Oh, definitely. There were dissents. Justice O'Connor, for instance, really emphasized federalism concerns, the idea of states as laboratories of democracy, arguing the federal government was overreaching without solid proof of a substantial effect on the interstate market in this specific medical context.
And Justice Thomas, he often has strong views on the Commerce Clause.
He dissented too, warning, much like the Lopez majority, that this kind of reasoning could grant Congress almost unlimited power, blurring the lines between federal and state authority. And Justice Scalia had a concurrence, interestingly, arguing that necessary and proper clause also helped justify regulating the interstate medical marijuana as part of the broader scheme to control the interstate illegal market.
Okay, so quite a bit of debate even within the court on where those lines are.
Always. These cases are rarely simple.
So pulling it all together then, we start with Gibbons, broad power over interstate movement and trade. Wickard expands it dramatically with the aggregation principle for economic activities. Heart of Atlanta uses that broad power for civil rights linked to interstate travel.
Right, a steady expansion.
Then Lopez comes along and says, wait, there's a limit. If the activity itself isn't economic and the link to commerce is too indirect, Congress can't regulate it under the Commerce Clause. Guns near schools fall outside.
A significant assertion of limits, yeah.
But then Raich clarifies that Lopez didn't kill Wickard. For activities deemed economic, like producing marijuana, the aggregation principle is still alive and well, and Congress can regulate even purely local instances if they affect the national market.
You've got it. It's an evolution. Lopez was a crucial check, demanding a real link to economic activity or interstate commerce itself. But Raich shows that for things the court sees as economic, Congress still has considerable power, drawing on that Wickard logic. The specific facts, economic versus non-economic, really seem to be the key differentiator in the post-Lopez world.
So for everyone listening, understanding Lopez isn't just about, guns near schools. It's about this fundamental tension in the U.S. system, the balance of power between the federal government and the states.
Exactly. And the Commerce Clause has been and continues to be a major battleground for defining that balance. Seeing how the interpretation shifts with cases like Gibbons, Wickard, Lopez, and Raich helps understand how federal authority expands and sometimes contracts.
It touches so many areas of law and policy.
It really does, which leads to a final thought, maybe something for you to chew on.
Okay, lay it on us.
Well, we've been talking about commerce mostly in terms of physical goods, travel, agriculture. But commerce today is so different, right? Digital commerce, data flows, online services that cross state and national borders instantly.
Yeah, the economy looks way different than it did even in 1995, let alone 1824.
Exactly. So the question is, how might the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Commerce Clause adapt to this world? What kinds of digital or intangible activities might be seen as having that substantial relation to interstate commerce? And will the principles from Lopez, the need for an economic nature, the concern about attenuated links, still act as a limit, maybe in surprising ways, in this new landscape?
That's a really interesting question. Where do you draw the lines when commerce itself becomes less physical? Definitely something to think about.